It is Sunday, the 23rd of April, 2017. I'm in front of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, just getting started up in my alternative spiritual practice of protesting against various Unitarian Universalist injustices, abuses, and indeed hypocrisies. Multiple hypocrisy, that is. All different kinds of hypocrisy. And just one of those injustices and abuses, to say nothing of hypocrisies, is the fact that Unitarians, indeed Unitarian Universalists, go to extreme and even quite foolish lengths to cover up and deny clergy abuse of all kinds. That is, clergy sexual abuse, but also non-sexual clergy abuse, abuse of power, verbal abuse, psychological abuse, and so on. As far as clergy sexual abuse goes, the Unitarian Universalist Association and some of its top-level leadership, specifically, like certain specific individuals, are guilty of trying to cover up and even outright deny the sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers. Say nothing of Unitarian Universalist Sunday school teachers. I think an excellent example of a top-level UUA leader going to extreme and foolish lengths to try to cover up and deny clergy sexual abuse of children is current UUA moderator Jim Key, who, as UUA moderator, was informed by myself, and I expect by other people, about sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist clergy soon after he became the moderator of the UUA in June of 2013, if not earlier. I think there's a very reasonable grounds to believe that UUA moderator Jim Key was actually aware of sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist clergy even before he was elected as moderator. But certainly in the wake of his being elected as moderator of the UUA in June of 2013, I entered into direct contact with him via email and also one lengthy phone conversation that lasted approximately an hour and a half. And within the context of trying to persuade him to ensure that the Reverend Dr. Peter Morales-led UUA administration was compelled to formally withdraw its false, blasphemous libel accusation against me, which is another way that Unitarian Universalists try to cover up and deny clergy sexual abuse, indeed sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist clergy. I made it very, very clear to UUA moderator Jim Key that certain Unitarian Universalist ministers were in fact guilty of such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape, and that some of them had even been charged, tried, and convicted of what the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney describes as such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. So in my emails to Jim Key and in my hour-and-a-half long telephone conversation with him, I gave him plenty of evidence to show that Unitarian Universalist ministers, some of them, had been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children, including the forcible rape of children. And yet, in delivering his first moderator's report to the Unitarian Universalist Association, 1 year after being elected as the moderator of the UUA, in June of 2014, UUA moderator Jim Key stood up in front of thousands of delegates to the annual General Assembly of Unitarian Universalists, which that year was held in Providence, Rhode Island, And in the middle of his first moderator's report, he inserted what was supposed to be a second UUA apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct, and specifically a official apology on the part of the UUA Board of Trustees to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. And this apology essentially minimized the extent and seriousness of clergy sexual misconduct of all kinds. It basically said only a small number of Unitarian Universalist ministers were guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, when in fact no less than 40% of the Unitarian Universalist associations, approximately 1,000 congregations in North America, had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. That's not a small number. A minimum of 400 congregations, as calculated by a group of Unitarian Universalist interim ministers who started counting how many Unitarian Universalist congregations had been affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another, in cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers had actually had complaints brought against them. And they counted up to 14, and I guess out of disillusionment and despair, they just stopped counting. So the fact of the matter is that there could be considerably more than 400 Unitarian Universalist congregations affected by clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. But worse than that, and this is where we come back to the sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers, Jim Key outright denied any knowledge of any sexual abuse of children in his utterly worthless, in my view, official apology to victims of clergy sexual misconduct. He said, and this is an exact quote from his so-called apology, "There were no incidents of abuse of children or elders in my investigations." So Jim Key, UUA moderator Jim Key, who, by the way, is also a risk management consultant, apparently a certified risk management consultant. He will let you decide the meaning of the word certified. Here he is claiming that he investigated Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct personally, his own personal investigations, and in those personal investigations of Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct, he found no evidence whatsoever of any sexual abuse of children. This is an outright lie. This is simply not true. As I said, I personally told UUA moderator Jim Key about a number of cases of sexual abuse of children by Unitarian Universalist ministers, including, not limited to, by the way, the forcible rape of teenage Tibetan refugees by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell. This is a publicly known case of sexual abuse of teenagers, who I think most people will agree are children, by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell, who was charged, tried, and convicted of the rape of teenage Tibetan refugees in the early 1990s. And there have been other cases where Unitarian Universalist ministers have been charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children. It may not always be possible to know exactly, the specific charges that they were convicted of, because the Unitarian Universalist Association does try to keep this hidden as much as possible. But there is zero question that a certain number of Unitarian Universalist ministers, including some in the Boston area, and including some in the Indianapolis area, or one anyway. If I'm not mistaken, it was Indianapolis, the one I'm thinking of. These ministers were charged, tried, and convicted of the sexual abuse of children. And this was known to the UUA, obviously. And yet, UUA moderator Jim Key claimed in his so-called official apology, which was delivered on behalf of the UUA Board of Trustees. So as far as I'm concerned, the whole UUA Board of Trustees is implicated in these lies. He claimed that he had thoroughly investigated clergy sexual misconduct and had found no evidence whatsoever of sexual abuse of children. Outright lie. A shameful, brazen, bald-faced lie on the part of UUA moderator Jim Key. And of course, from what I can see, Unitarian Universalists were only too happy to swallow Jim Key's brazen, bald-faced lies about sexual abuse committed by Unitarian Universalist ministers, because they just prefer not to believe that, their ministers are capable of such things. They prefer to wallow in willful ignorance and psychological denial rather than know the truth about clergy sexual misconduct in general and clergy sexual abuse of children in particular. So, very, very pathetic willful ignorance and psychological denial on the part of a great many Unitarian Universalists. Indeed, pretty much all of the Unitarian Universalists who I have shared this information with prefer to, block me out, block their ears, literally or figuratively, cover their eyes, literally or figuratively, wallow in willful ignorance and psychological denial. And that certainly includes pretty much the whole congregation of the Unitarian Church of Montreal, because I have been protesting against all forms of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse since the late 1990s. Although I didn't specifically refer to sexual abuse for various reasons, because I wanted to deal with all forms of clergy abuse, both sexual and non-sexual, so I would use the broader term clergy abuse rather than clergy sexual abuse, or the broader term abuse of clergy, because that covers all forms of abuse by Unitarian Universalist ministers, not just sexual abuse. So while my picket signs may not have specifically referenced sexual abuse, because as I said, I was protesting all forms of clergy sexual abuse and wanted to make it clear, that sexual abuse is not the only form of clergy abuse, that there are non-sexual forms of clergy abuse. Nonetheless, that term, clergy abuse, is commonly understood to mean sexual abuse. So I don't think I was, how can I put it? I think it was, anyone who saw the term clergy abuse could have and should have, and I believe would have, certainly included clergy sexual abuse in that. I don't think they would have thought only in terms of non-sexual abuse. On the contrary, if anything, they thought only in terms of sexual abuse and didn't think of the broader forms of clergy misconduct, clergy abuse, because the term clergy abuse is so commonly understood to mean clergy sexual abuse. So I've been protesting against Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse outside the Unitarian Church of Montreal for the better part of 20 years. And good day. Not only have Montreal Unitarians obstinately ignored this protest, but they have gone to immoral, unethical, borderline criminal, and I'd even say in some cases actually criminal, efforts to force an end to my protest. As far as actually criminal behavior on the part of Unitarian Universalists, which can be seen as trying to, if not force an end to my protest, at least limit my protest, I have had picket signs stolen by Montreal Unitarians on several different occasions, and I've also been physically assaulted on several different occasions by Montreal Unitarians, to say nothing of non-Montreal Unitarians. There's been at least one assault on me by a non-Montreal Unitarian. There's been at least 3 assaults against me committed by Montreal Unitarians. Indeed, quite prominent. Actually, no, I'm thinking there's been at least, what am I thinking? There's been at least 4. I forgot one in particular. There's been at least 4 physical assaults against me by Montreal Unitarians. Specifically, Pierre Bennett, very early on in my protest, physically assaulted me. Kenneth Howard, QC, physically assaulted me in the process of stealing my picket signs. Wasn't a very serious assault. He basically just shoved me backwards, but that's technically assault, and as a Queen's